Hi everyone, my name is Chris Clark. I'm Senior Curator here at the Glucksman. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's artist talk with Sara Baume, accompanying our current exhibition at the Glucksman, Home, Being and Belonging in Contemporary Ireland. This talk invites participating artists to discuss their practices, recent projects, exhibited works, and are taking place throughout the duration of the exhibition, all the way up to the end of October. Sara Baume is a writer and artist based in West Cork. She's the author of 2 novels and a non-fiction book called Handiwork, published in spring 2020. In autumn 2018, her debut solo exhibition took place in the Morley Gallery in central London with the support of Culture Ireland. And in her visual projects, as in her writing, she pursues an obsession with the world of detail and with the potential force of small objects made with affection and solicitude. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the format, we'll have a pre-recorded presentation for the next 20-25 minutes or so by Sara that we recorded earlier. And then we're going to link back up live for discussion and Q&A. And of course, you can, as always, pose your questions using the chat function. And please keep in mind that these talks and conversations will be available to view on the Glucksman YouTube channel afterwards. So without further ado, I will hand over to Sara Baume.
Okay, so as you've guessed from Chris's introduction, I don't have very much on my artist CV. So I'm going to talk today about a handful of projects from the past couple of years, including obviously the one that's on show at the moment at the Glucksman, and sort of tell the story of how they came to be, which is also the story of the events that surrounded their making. All of my projects more or less tell stories from my life, from my ordinary days, and hopefully these also turn out to be stories from other people's lives and other people's ordinary days. So I make a bit of something every day. Sometimes I work compulsively. More of the time it's sort of scattered and impulsive. Most of the images I'll be showing you now were taken in domestic settings, on the kitchen table, up the stairs, down the garden path, and quite a few of them are, and I apologize for sort of poor quality mobile phone shots. I instinctively choose the tools and materials of hobby shops and DIY stores, such as plywood, plaster, cotton yarn, and cement. And I work mostly at home in this rented house, divided into miscellaneous workstations, and I work very slowly, producing tens or hundreds of miniatures to be exhibited as collections or modest installations. I work as much as possible, I guess it's important to say, in the spirit of folk art, in spite of the fact that I myself come from no fixed community or set of traditions. In my artwork, I'm attempting to delineate my culture and to generate a family of meaningful artifacts to represent it. I'm not so interested in cleverness or originality as I am in solicitude and commitment. And if this talk had an epigraph, or a preamble, sorry, that was the preamble, and I'm going to get rid of my face now in a minute, but my epigraph would be from Henry Glassy, the folklorist. Every work of art, he wrote, should contain the wholeness of human commitment. And I'm also really fond of quoting Agnes Martin. Artwork, Agnes Martin said, is a representation of our devotion to life. So I'm just going to get rid of me and go on to the first slide. So this is the flowers. So I made this piece. It's the simplest way of talking about my practice. I made it at intervals throughout 2017, from January to December. My dad died in the summer of 2016, and so 2017 was the first full year of his absence. And I would make a point of visiting my mother once every couple of weeks, and I would always sleep over at least a night because it's about 2 hours drive away. And every time I slept over, she would leave out this little vase of flowers for me. They were always picked from her garden, and she would always place them on the flat timber arm of the chair beside the bed beneath the lamp, and she nearly always used the same vase, which is in the shape of an owl with a hole in the top of its head. You can see it in a few pictures here. So this gesture was one she probably performed for years, all through my time in college, but it took the absence of my dad for me to really notice it and to appreciate the diligence of it, the tenderness. And so, as a kind of reciprocal gesture, a complimentary offering of devotion, I decided I would make a replica of every different species of flower that appeared in the owl vase over the course of the year. So I would take a picture on my phone, this is what you're looking at now, every time I slept over, and then at home again I would identify the flower and then reconstruct the leaves and petals from modeling clay, and then the stems or twigs that I collected and whittled the bark off and painted green. Around the same time, I was in The Hague for a festival, and I definitely borrowed something from those beautiful kind of wooden tulips that you see everywhere in the Netherlands. I have a certain affection for souvenirs, and that's something that will come up again and again in this talk. I had the opportunity to show this piece, which are these pictures here, in a little exhibition in London in 2018. And for the exhibition, I bought a bolt of black velvet and laid it over a long plywood board and pinned the devotional flowers in a row. There were 33, I think, by the end of the year. And the intention was that they would echo the old glass display cabinets that you find in Victorian era natural history museums. And I should say that the photographs here were by J. Armstrong, the ones from the installation. So the next piece I will talk about now is the plates. Now, these pictures were taken in 2011, and this was sort of like the upstairs hallway in the first home that I shared with my partner. It was this really rundown little terraced house on a seafront above a hairdresser's in a village called Whitegate, which Corkonians will probably know. And when we first moved in, I was looking for decorative matter to cover up the appalling walls. And Mark, my partner, happened to be doing a sea scheme in Cove Museum, which is directly opposite Whitegate on the other side of Cork Harbour. It's a little maritime museum. It's going to come up again in this talk, in fact, in a former Presbyterian church. And there'd been an exhibition there that focused on local souvenirs. And there was a woman that neither of us had ever met, and she donated her lifetime collection of souvenir plates. And then, as the story goes, she had her kitchen redecorated, and she didn't want them back again afterwards. So one day we carried home these 2 boxes filled with somebody else's collection of sentimental objects, like literally spanning decades. And they were from places like the Costa Brava and Bermuda and Hawaii and Ibiza, like places neither Mark or I had ever actually been or were ever likely to choose to go. So like a tiny bit on souvenirs, I've always been attracted to souvenirs. The tackier, the better. I love the idea that it might be possible to combine all of the color, complexity, nuance, and particularity of a place, of an experience, to a single suitcase-sized object. I love the audacity of the souvenir, the miraculous act of reductionism it represents. And souvenir plates are perhaps the most splendid example of this reductionism, in how they take like a handful of the most archetypal images of their country and then squeeze them together onto a single shiny surface. So like I think I have a Parisian one that has sort of the Eiffel Tower and then a vineyard and the Pyrenees and then a man with a moustache and a berry. So when we started with the plates, it was the height of the recession. And Mark and I were both on the dole and could hardly pay the rent, let alone go on holidays. And so the collection of plates became a running joke. And we would make a point of seeking out souvenir plates in junk markets and charity shops. And the only criteria was that they had to be from places that neither of us had ever been. So the collection of souvenir plates from places we've never been was a joke, but it was also a form of yearning. And it went on until 2015 when my first novel was published and published to acclaim. And then my second novel was published in 2017. And so between 2015 and 2019, my opportunities for travel unexpectedly kind of exploded, really. So I started to see the world again, albeit in a methodical kind of way. So I would travel to vastly different places like Los Angeles, Ottawa, Iowa, Geneva, Gothenburg, Dubai, Singapore, Beijing, but always in a way I was traveling to the same event, to the International Literary Festival, and I would mix with more or less the same demographic of people. And I was often left with little opportunity for sightseeing, or the only sightseeing I'd do was kind of scheduled. And I spent a lot of time in hotels I could never myself have afforded during those years, and a lot of time in transit. And I became really interested in the banal patterns that I encountered in those places, in the upholstery of train seats and hotel cushion covers, and the carpeting of airport terminals and event space corridors. And this is what you're looking at here. And quite a few of them have my feet in them. I'm going to drop in a quote by the anthropologist Tim Ingold. He wrote that modern metropolitan societies have converted travel from an experience of movement into which action and deception are intimately coupled into one of enforced immobility and sensory deprivation. And so at a certain point, I became really fascinated in these prosaic patterns, and I started to take what you're looking at now, these surreptitious photographs, often blurred, often including one of my feet. And then during the waiting around time that is ubiquitous to such forms of travel, I would sit with a little sketchbook that I always carried with me, and I would draw the photos that I'd taken, or sometimes the patterned surfaces themselves, depending upon where I was sitting. And then I would add a note of context, and at home again, I would go back to the charity shops and buy secondhand plates, always white china, though the sizes and shapes and condition varied slightly. And then I would paint my collection of prosaic patterns and make a new set of souvenir plates from places I had just actually been. So this is two of them. The last one there was a parquet floor, and I think that was a rug. And then this again, the few following pictures are from the exhibition in London, and they're by J. Armstrong again. So they were exhibited along with the flowers. And by then there were about 4 sketchbooks and about 210 plates. And in 2019, I only made a few trips because by then I'd actually just started feeling awful about my carbon footprint. And then came 2020, of course, and for obvious reasons, that was the end of my travels and by extension, the series of plates. So the next piece is the piece that you see in the Glux, or that's on show in the Glucksman at the moment. But there was kind of quite a lot of work that fed into it over the years. So I'll begin at the beginning. So I grew up in rural Ireland in a parish called Lisgould, which is just outside Middleton in East Cork, not far from Whitegate and places I've already mentioned. I tend to refer it as the unspectacular Irish countryside because there aren't any epic mountains or ancient forests or sea, but it's fine. It's nice. I was lucky to be surrounded by fields when I was a child. There was a lot of tillage and beef and cows. And I was obviously desperate to leave. As soon as I had finished school, I moved to Dublin and went to art college. And then I lived mainly in Dublin for several years, though I visited the school thousands of times and even spent months at a stretch staying at home in my parents' house during those years. It wasn't until about 2010, when I'd settled more decisively back in the school, that I started to notice what had been happening incrementally in my absence to the landscape that I had grown up in. Now, these years that I was in college coincided with the height of the property boom, and as we all know, a time when unscrupulous planners from every county council allowed one-off housing to spring up all over rural Ireland. And the school was a prime spot for this because it's very close to a big town and it's very easy commuting distance from a big city. So it took me years to mentally register all of this new housing. And it was, I guess, and it was an otherwise undistracting phase of life. And then all of a sudden I was filled with rage. I took it very personally. I felt as if my idealized memories of childhood had been violated somehow. There was the hacking down of trees I'd once climbed, and then the concreting over of grassy hills I once rolled down. There was by then quite a bit of traffic on the narrow roads where I used to walk my childhood Jack Russell. The field where I once played on the bales was by then some stranger's vast, empty lawn. They were huge, mainly these new houses. So sorry, this photograph is actually a reasonably conservative one. Sometimes more than a dozen front-facing windows, and they had these strange appendages: turrets, mock fanlights, asymmetrical dormers, and expansive conservatories. And they were attached to the road by long driveways behind tall metal gates that opened electronically, and that could only be accessed by codes and keypads, reminding me I was not welcome. Now, I don't now completely understand why I was, at the time, quite so incensed by this. So initially I would sneak around the parish and hide in hedges and take photographs of the houses that were foreign to me, that were somehow offensive to me. And then at home again, I'd study the pictures, and I started to make models. At first, skeletons out of plywood and dowel, which is what you're looking at here. And then I would build on the flesh of the house with miscellaneous scrap, rags, cardboard, timber offcuts, even straw. The idea was to draw a contrast between the grandiosity of the monster houses and my choice of coarse, everyday materials, and the intention being to invent an updated and deeply cynical souvenir. They were each quite large, I mean, much larger than what I'm showing now in the Glucksman. I snuck in a picture there of my childhood Jack Russell, just for effect. So I only did about 7 and then moved on, and I was less angry for several years. Mark and I have been lucky to be able to rent places by the sea for a reasonable price. But then around 2017, I started to get disgruntled again. And the best explanation I have for this is that the older I get, the more I get broody for property. And in the last 4 or 5 years, I've become borderline obsessive about it, about daft and cheap Irish houses and micro shelters and tiny homes and steel tech sheds. And this sort of academic annoyance that I initially felt about the occupation of space previously occupied by nature has morphed into a kind of bitterness about the fact that other people can afford to buy houses or buy land and build houses, and I can't. So my starting point this time was more particularly the iconic Irish cottage souvenir. I started working with modeling plaster. I tend to favor domestic materials, and for this project, I wanted it to seem as if the miniature houses had somehow sort of literally fallen down out of the walls of the room that I worked in. At first, I carved all the details in, the windows and doors and architraves, and that was only after I'd made about 100 that I decided there was something too literal about them, too cartoon-like, or too sort of I don't know, too wobbly. So I put them away, and I started the series that are on show now in the Glucksman. So the following few pictures are from when this piece was shown in London, and they're by J. Armstrong again. So this piece is Talismans. It's a series of 100 miniature houses. Each one is made to the scale of the cottage souvenir, but in the corrupted style of a contemporary rural dwelling. At the beginning of each row of, I'm referring now to how it's shown in the Glucksman. It was shown slightly differently in London. But the idea is that the beginning of each row, these pictures are from the Glucksman now, and they were taken by Kenneth O'Halloran. The idea is that the structures are roughly recognizably house-like, echoing bungalows or farmhouses, but as each line proceeds, they become increasingly abstract and kind of futuristic. And so by the end of each row, some of the structures look more similar to a stack of toy blocks, say, or an improvised shrine or a convoluted dolmen than any kind of realistic contemporary home. So from summer 2017 to summer 2018, I would sit for a couple of hours most evenings, cradling these little structures, first carving them and later assembling them, and later again painting and repainting them. I made about 202 in total and discarded about 100. And as I worked, I would listen to Radio 1, and it was only towards the end of the project that I realized how the national news stories that had dominated that 12-month cycle concerned the worsening housing crisis. And it was a year of rising rents, rising house prices, rising homelessness, and I had spent it shaping these talismans as if by this means I might channel my anxieties about the extinction of landscapes and the scarcity of sustainable homes, as if these miniatures and the process of their making might symbolize an attempt to protect against the future as well as to preserve the past. So this is the work that I made last summer for Home from Home. And it's very much a companion series to Talismans. It's made up of 100 palm-sized objects based again on the traditional Irish cottage souvenir. But this time each one is a tiny effigy of the rented house where I live and where I've spent all of the lockdowns. And where I'm speaking to you from today, in fact. I was trying to be ironic, I suppose, about the idea of making a souvenir of home and about what that process would feel like. And it was boring, of course. And the finished series are a lot like my days then and a lot like my days still now. They all look the same from a distance, but the closer you get, the easier it is to make little distinctions. For they're all handmade, and so they're all very slightly different and very slightly imperfect. And I became very interested in the light, really, and how it fell and how it changed the shades of greys and greens. And I wrote an essay about these that was in the summer 2021 issue of the Dublin Review. So I haven't made any miniature houses in a while now, but I included a few pictures here just for fun, because lately I've started to notice them popping up in unexpected places, dare I say haunting me. And now that the housing market is awful again and I've completely given up hope of ever becoming a part of it. So these last few photographs are all of found miniature houses, some in woods, one was on a grave, one was just on someone's gatepost. So that's the houses, and the last thing I'm going to talk about is, I guess, the current and future project, which is the ships. Anyone who follows me on Instagram will be very familiar with these. But I want to go back to their genesis, really, and so that means going back again to when I was living in Cork Harbour. I mentioned that Mark, my partner, was working in the Little Maritime Museum in Cove. On the other side of the harbour, and this was before he had a driving license, so I would have to drop him off in the morning and pick him up again in the evening. And I spent a lot of time hanging around that museum, and I became completely infatuated during those years with this one particular artifact, and that was the model of a ship called the St. Andrew. And the photographs just coming here are by Leon Allen. So it's about 50 inches long and 6 high. The hull's made from dismantled and remolded bully beef cans, and it's painted with a red cross. And this is because what it represents is a hospital ship from the First World War. Very little is known of its origins, and I know this emphatically because I had a good stab at tracing them, and this accumulated in a radio essay for Sunday Miscellany around 2013. So the story goes that it was built by a surgeon serving aboard the real St. Andrew during the war. as a nighttime hobby, and it ended up being donated to Cove Museum in about 2008. And it was only when a member of staff set about the job of cleaning it that a further 3 decks were discovered concealed inside the hall. There were all of these tiny furnishings and matchstick soldiers dressed in pajamas or holding crutches with bandages wrapped around some part of themselves. In the pictures here, you can see a soldier reading a newspaper, playing cards. This one here, sort of over in the corner, is the officer's mess, and there's actually a tiny model of the model in the model. So it's really exceptional amongst model ships for its attention to detail, and because it was crafted entirely from the scrap material of everyday life, from the litter of a surgeon's existence. And I'm obviously obsessed with things that are scratch built. And I was completely charmed by the St. Andrew and by the patience and care with which it was made, and the way that it embodies these qualities. It has this sort of glow of tenderness and effort. And I mention it really only because it was what got me started with the model ship. At that time, as I've already mentioned, I was living in the harbour. But the view out our front windows, though it contained the sea, was not awfully romantic. It also contained a busy road, mudflats, and storage tanks of the oil refinery. And I was always fascinated by how many of the owners of the large houses up the hill from the village displayed model ships on their windowsills. And these were always elegant model sailing ships like caravels and clippers with clinker-built hulls and starched white sails. And I found it ironic that the harbour these windows overlooked was a busy port, dominated by inelegant tugs and trawlers, naval vessels and oil tankers, and mainly container ships. So for 5 years, I talked about making an ironic model container ship for our windowsill. But in all those years, I never got around to it, and then we moved. And I didn't think about model ships for years. And then in the summer of 2019, I happened to be in Aberdeen on the northeast coast of Scotland, and I visited the City Maritime Museum, just incidentally. And it was there that I came across the picture here that I came, the little picture that has an awful reflection of the window in it. And this is an example of a votive ship, and it dates from the 15th century. It's made from wood and cord and metal, and it really held my attention. I'd never seen anything like it before. So I did a bit of research then and found that votive ships, also called church ships, can date as far back as the Middle Ages. They represent a tradition in which models were gifted by seamen and shipbuilders to the church. They were offered in petition to protect the vessel from harm as it set out on a voyage, or in gratitude for the protection of the vessel on its safe return, or in memorial of a lost ship. And they would be hung by thin chains from the ceiling in a central position in order to remind the congregation of their dependence on seafaring. They're most common in the Protestant churches of Scandinavia, and there are no examples that I know of from Ireland. And the photograph here was taken by my friend Regan Hutchins in a church in Brittany. So while I was reading about the votive ships, I found a few images of them displayed against stained glass windows. And this was when the stacked geometric forms and incongruously bright colours of the container ships came back to me. And this connection to religion and to ritualization was the prod I felt I needed to start my own series. So my container ships are again made from modeling plaster. Initially, I was casting them in the packaging of food products. Most of the hulls came from plastic herb trays. Most of the containers come from matchboxes. And I like the idea that the smallest kind of vessel, a matchbox, becomes a replica for the largest kind of vessel, a shipping container. I like the lightness and solidity of plaster when hulls and containers are heavy, hollow things. And I carve the set plaster to size by eye and by feel, and then I paint and I glue and I varnish them. So I should maybe flag here that I have a rather unprofessional, inefficient way of working. Though I'm fascinated by the high level of skill and attention to detail and devotion that amateur craftsmen put in, and there's quite a bit about this, something that I wrote about quite a lot in Handiwork. For me, it's more important to capture the spirit of the original as opposed to represent it with perfect accuracy. And so my ships are all miniature, faulty versions of reality. But I also wanted them to resemble glossy, garish little souvenir-like objects. I wanted them to say something oblique about consumer capitalism. Not unlike the houses, these talismanic miniatures are my attempt to come to terms with the tremendous onslaught of stuff, its endless production, and the damage it does. So I've been making container ships rather purposelessly for a couple of years, and then several months, which makes it sound like there's millions. There's in fact probably only about 30. at some point I alighted on the idea of making sails for my model vessels. I adore textiles and I do a lot of stitching. And so since the beginning of my shipbuilding, I was only for these sort of wonderfully aesthetic appendages. And so I'd already started designing model sails for my model container ships. And then I read in a book called Down to the Sea with Ships by an author called Horatio Clare. And it was essentially a travelogue in which the author spends several months as a passenger on a couple of different commercial vessels. And he was writing about how sails for container ships are in fact already being developed, obviously for environmental purposes, by the Swedes, I think, but also the Chinese. And then, of course, I Googled it, and there they were. So I adore the serendipity of this, that I imagined this fictional, futuristic kind of ship, only to find that it actually already existed or was already in development, as if to teach me that there is, in fact, nothing left to imagine. And so I plowed on, and there are about 20 decent models in the series now, about 20 with sails. And I've just started changing my methods and scaling them up a bit. And in January next year, I'll be based in the Ullin Arts Centre here in Skibbereen for a few months to develop this and to draw out its connections. I guess I'm already in a kind of a research phase for that. I think that's it. Thanks a million.
Hi, and welcome back. And I can welcome, hey Sarah, how's it going?
Hi, yeah.
Hi, and thank you so much. It's I know we just recorded that this morning, but it's kind of great even to watch it all over again now, and a great insight into your practice and some of the recent projects you've been working on. And so I have a few questions myself, of course, to ask you, but also I invite our attendees today to pose questions using the chat or Q&A function for Sarah as well, and we'll try and get as many as we can. But for now, I'm going to monopolize your time a little bit here and just ask you a bit about one of the things that kind of stood out to me, I guess, about your practice and certainly specific projects was the way that you employ, I guess, processes of repetition and seriality. And I wonder if, can you tell us a little bit more about, why you work this way and what this kind of notion of repetition kind of means to your practice?
It's probably it's probably a means of making up for the smallness of the stuff that I make. I think, it's a very boring reason to say that, when you leave college and you suddenly don't have space. And I had to compensate. And for years, of course, I compensated by writing. Like a lot of the reason that I started to write was because it was so compact. And now in recent years, or I guess all throughout the time that I was writing books, I was also making objects, but always small objects, because I just didn't have the space. I've never had a proper studio space. And so I've always sort of continued to, like I mean, I was ashamed of this for years, but now I can sort of, I feel I can claim the fact that I make things at home in the evenings and on my own domestic surfaces. But of course, necessarily they're small. And so how do you make something small have impact? Now you make loads of them, you make it over and over and over again. Or now I don't really believe that because, like in traditional art, in folk art, the smaller something is, the more it's respected in a way, because it's a marker of skill. It takes much, much more skill to make something that's tiny than to make something that's big and rough or whatever. But I mean, but really the reason why I've made things that have repeated and repeated, I made things in series as a means of making up for the fact that they're small. And I suppose also as a means of emphasizing my point. When something is small and it's easy to overlook it, you can kind of, you can make sure that people know you mean it by doing it again and again and again.
But always with I mean, certainly with variations built into it as well. So I think of it even when looking at the presentation here, and this idea of like honing something or kind of seeing what else it can do within this particular template. And is that something that you think about in terms of, I think you actually even mentioned in your talk something about the kind of tediousness of the labor, I think that it takes on, but also that kind of capacity, I guess, to kind of experiment in the actual realization of the work.
Yeah. I mean, anyone who's read handiwork will know that I talk quite a bit about William Morris and John Ruskin. And, Morris's thing, or possibly Ruskin, I get them confused, but one or other of them, or possibly one of them paraphrasing the other, said that artwork is the expression of man's pleasure and labor, so that the finished object, was as much about the work that was put into it, the care that was put into it, the time, as the thing itself. as any bigger concept. So that's always on my mind. But it's also like, for me, it's constantly a way of sort of compensating, like with the talismans piece that's in the Glucksman. If there'd been some way, I don't really have any great skills, so I didn't really know how to make a mold that would then, allow me to make the same object 100 times over. So instead I was casting blocks and then cutting them down and carving them. And so they were necessarily all slightly different. So like I say, it was a means of almost compensating for my lack of skill. And it's taken me years to embrace that and be like, oh, okay, this is actually what perhaps my practice is about. Instead of going away and gaining the skills, I tried to use what I have and make something out of that.
Well, you provided also a wonderful segue for me here as well, because in mentioning kind of William Morrison, this was kind of one of the things that kind of piqued my interest when you spoke about kind of folk art. And I wonder if how you think about that notion of kind of folk art or the arts and craft movement as being kind of in kind of decisive opposition to, the more kind of industrial mass production that you might see in kind of Taylorism or kind of the assembly line under Ford. And what are those kind of, you also spoke quite eloquently, obviously, about the housing crisis. I wonder if you talk a little bit about some of the politics behind this notion of using, in some cases, maybe mass-produced souvenirs, but at the same time, this notion of kind of artisanship and what it means in terms of its position towards, or its stance towards a more kind of capitalist kind of mass consumption and production kind of system that we're in.
Yeah, it's the William Morrison, the arts and crafts movement, obviously came about as a rejection of the Industrial Revolution. But I feel like now there's definitely people are moving back towards handmade things and the sort of attention to the detail of craftsmanship, perhaps as a kick against the digital revolution. But then, like, even more so than ever the last year and a half. Because I think we're all so weary of looking at screens, and we're kind of dying to either, work with hard copies, if it's for want of a better word, or with real objects, real artifacts, and then to see those things and sort of feel those things and smell those things when we go out in the world. So yeah, that's always been something that's close to my heart. And personally, I went from art college, and I studied in IADT in the I guess the early noughties, and there was an awful lot of emphasis placed upon new media at the time. Like there was, I'm sure it's changed now, but there was 2D, which was painting, 3D, which was sculpture, and then 4D, which was film, and of course they're really renowned now as the National Film College. But at the time I felt kind of uneasy in that, because I was always very much driven to craft. I probably should have, studied some element of craft instead of fine art. But at the time it was, so I kind of came out of college, I guess, really confused, and I ended up writing. And then of course for years you're sitting at a computer. So going back to making things with my hands when I was spending hours and hours every day, looking over manuscripts, reading things online, in sort of, track changes in editing documents. So it was my own personal little rebellion against how my life had become very screen based. And for a long time I didn't want to show things, I think, because I didn't feel the same need for validation, because I guess I was being validated as a writer, and the things that I was making were kind of like just for myself, and they changed shape a lot. And then around the end of hilariously around 2019, I started to think, no, I'd really like to show things now, and I'm gonna make an effort and apply for exhibition. I can't remember when the open call for Home from Home was possibly around then, but then of course there was the pandemic.
Yeah, it was a long time ago now, actually, I think.
I've just spent another year and a half accumulating stuff without showing it.
So maybe, yeah, they were originally 20 or 30 of the Testament's works, and you just had time to producing.
Yeah, very much so. But no, the whole, the folk art take, I've always been very interested in folk art. I came from, I studied, or I did an internship in the Douglas Hyde Gallery years and years ago, and some people will know what I mean by that and some won't, but they used to have a split between Gallery 1 and Gallery 2, and these were in the days when John Hutchinson was director. And in Gallery 2 they always had an exhibition that was folk art or ethnic art, or I'm trying to think, there was there were African flags at one point, Asafo flags, there were Japanese tea bowls, Coptic textiles. So it would always be something very different, but always positioned at a counterpoint to what the contemporary exhibition that was in Gallery 1. So that really, really changed how I thought about art. And I mean, possibly also because my mother's an archaeologist. So when we were kids, we were kind of brought to art galleries, but at the same time, we were being brought to natural history museums. And the two things just got bungled in my head, you know. And it's kind of, I've always felt that way. But then more recently, you know, anyone who hasn't seen Pat Collins' movie about Henry Glassy, Fieldwork, that's really been on my mind recently. And I've been reading books by Henry Glassy. So I've kind of become more fixated on folk art and the idea of art as something that's the project of a community. And it's helped me to let go what I clung on for years to, this idea of, you know, it has to be original, it has to be, you know, completely new. And if someone else has made anything even vaguely similar to this, then I have to fuck it in the bin, even if it's the best thing I've made in my life. Like, it gets chucked in the bin. And more recently, I suppose, in coming out of the things that the art that I came to through Gallery 2 and the Douglas Hyde, and then my interest in folk art, and all of these things, you know, I've realized that actually sometimes art's more interesting when it's similar to the things that other artists are making at the same time around it. And I mean, I see this in novel writing as well. You know, you find that there's a sort of a movement or a wave of, you know, maybe young women writers writing about whatever the case may be, feminism, or that's a kind of a not a very specific example, but you know what I mean. And then as an outsider, you look in at that and you think, God, it's really interesting that people are writing about the same things at the same moment, or climate change, you know, being the obvious one. And so why doesn't it make sense that people who come out of the same community make artwork that looks similar? You know, that should be embraced as opposed to, like, you know, fucked in the bin.
We're just yes, a kind of a desperate search for novelty, I suppose, as opposed to actually maybe trying to tap into something that's, I don't want to say universal, but certainly something that maybe kind of speaks across kind of wider audiences. I mean, obviously, you mentioned your practice as a writer, and I was particularly struck in your presentation about how you use the preamble, like kind of a prologue to talking about your work. And I wonder if maybe that's something you can just talk a little bit about, this the overlaps, I guess, between your work as an author, who I should also say, which also kind of bridges kind of, you know, fiction and kind of more non-fiction elements, and it's a memoir, and I guess kind of nature writing and all these kind of elements, and also I guess that kind of relationship between, you know, your writing practice and your visual arts practice. I mean, how do you negotiate that kind of relationship, I suppose?
Well, it's funny, like, I came to writing through writing about art. Because when I left college, again, because I'd studied sculpture, I needed space and I didn't have space. So I started writing and sort of working in art galleries and stuff. And the writing got published quite quickly. And I kind of thought, hey, shit, maybe this is what I'm good at. Because the artwork was just accumulating. And then I thought, well, if I'm gonna write, I'd like to write fiction, because fiction is what I've always read and most enjoyed reading. So for a while, it kind of it was very clearly, I'm going to try to be a writer and write writer-like stuff. But now more recently, I suppose, and that's easier to do when you've kind of, when I've, you know, now that I've had books published or whatever, it's kind of easier to drift and do what I want. And it's become very blurred, like the piece, Home From Home, the Home From Home piece of the souvenirs from home, the little house-shaped things, you know, at the same time that I was making those, I was writing. And then a line from the same, so it was sort of about, the essay in the end was about the process of making those pieces. And it was just so, you know, obvious to me to write. I was writing about the experience of the pandemic. And I was writing also about the experience of getting a wisdom tooth late in life. So it was both about the wisdom tooth and the making of the things. And then a line from that became the neon piece that was on the front of the sculpture factory, from the winter solstice from the summer solstice to the winter solstice. So I love the way from that one piece, actually, because it was the Home From Home project that came first, and then naturally I was writing about what was happening around it. And I mean, that was very much handiwork as well. You know, that's a very obvious example of how the two have overlapped. It's very easy to write about the things that obsess you. I suppose you're always just writing about the things that obsess you, and sometimes it it becomes fiction, and sometimes it remains non-fiction, and sometimes it's literally about the things that I'm making. But I do have a kind of a sense, like it's funny when I went to structuring handiwork, and the same with the novel, that I have a novel coming out next year. I was very conscious of how they would look on the page, and I wanted these big white spaces around the text, because I mean handiwork is so short. I didn't think anyone would take it seriously as a book, and you know, the way when you go into a gallery, the best way to show something small and slight is to put lots of space around it so that people will go, ooh, what's this? Yeah, the first trick of curating. But that was totally what I was doing with handiwork, and it, you know, my publishers thought it was wonderful. Ooh, where did you get this from? And I mean, I wasn't. I mean, to be honest, I'd robbed it from other books. There's lots of like short, neat books like that around at the moment. But the two things kind of, just like I say, cross over in my mind a lot. You know, the same with film, the same with music. I think, you know, it's very sad little small world if you're only really looking at one medium. And for me, that means I work in other mediums as well. It doesn't for everyone, but I think every good artist is kind of thinking in lots of different ways.
And can I ask you a little bit about the work you're showing in the Glucksman at the moment, and the way that you use, I guess, plaster in this kind of, in these numerous variations, and with this whiteness kind of, the illusion, I guess, could be kind of seen as the, you know, the ghost estates that cropped up throughout Ireland, you know, during and after the Celtic Tiger, but also, of course, with plaster, and you know, maybe this is just something I'm aware of. You know, when handling kind of artworks as well, is that, you know, it's a distinctly fragile medium, and it kind of has connotations of deterioration, of kind of crumbling, of dampness as well, of fractures. And I wonder if this fragility of this medium was important in your decision to work with plaster. I can imagine it's kind of a fraught process, kind of working from a block and then kind of honing it down into something which is actually quite intricate. And certainly there are a lot of parts on it that you know, they obviously have a very fine kind of attention to detail there. So I wonder if maybe you could talk a little bit about that choice of medium, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think I said in the talk that I really liked the idea of it being like literally I'm sitting in the house making these things, and it's surrounded by white plaster walls, and I had this sort of magic realist image of, you know, putting your fist into the wall and pulling out a handful of the plaster and then making a thing out of it, making a tiny house out of it. In fact, so it was partly that. I mean, partly because it's a nice thing to work in, and I wanted to use it in a slightly different way. So, like I say, rather than making a mold and casting it, or I was making molds out of the packaging that comes off sort of herbs and vegetables and biscuits, an awful lot of things. So I would pour the plaster into the packaging and then turn it out and then break it down and carve it. But then I ended up sort of compensating for its wobbliness by painting it like several times. And I would use the same white emulsion, like literally, like this is a rented house, and there's in the shed there's been, it's not there anymore because I've used it on art, but there was this big tub of white emulsion. So it was about sort of using the material that was there, and it has this lovely kind of stickiness and shine that, you know, acrylic paint doesn't. So I ended up painting them as if you were, you know, recoating the walls of a house almost. But it also sort of filled in the gaps and made them stick together. So kind of like by virtue of my inefficiency, I feel like that sort of leads me to an object that looks a little strange, but by making it in the way it probably should be made, it doesn't have the same sort of quality of like despair, or whatever it is. Yeah, so no, I mean, and I've done, like, the ships are also plaster, though I'm changing my methods a little bit now as I scale them up. And everything I use, I tend to favor, and I write a bit about this in Handiwork, the tools or the materials of like art and hobby shops, or, you know, sort of Vibes and Scribes. They're amateur materials, really, because I have this huge interest in amateur art. Mark's Models, you know, the model making shop in Cork, and they're sort of balsa wood, and so, you know, using those as much as I can without actually making something that comes out of a kit, or using them in a way that they shouldn't be used, if that makes sense.
Well, I have a question here as well, from one of our attendees, which is, I think you might understand this, where the boat piece is made in the same fashion. So to some extent.
Yeah, exactly. I think they were made in, what was it, like a laptop. They're really quite small. I mean, I think my hand was in one of them. And I'm trying to scale them up a bit, and I am actually making a mold, which will make things a bit more efficient. Because I actually just got bored. I sat down, I made 20 of them, and I carved every single container. And it was a means of like, I will meditate, I will reflect on consumer capitalism as I do this, and all of the stuff that's in the world. I was hugely influenced by when we lived in Cork Harbour, there was this huge boat, huge container ship, and everyone called it the banana boat, or somebody called it the banana boat, and this stuck in my head. And it still comes in, the boat that has all of the bananas that are eaten in Ireland for the entire week in it. And it leaves them in Ireland, and then it goes back out to wherever it goes. And that was such a simple image, just this boat full of bananas, this huge ship full of all the bananas that everyone will eat in Ireland. And then it goes away again, and the next week it comes back full of bananas. Cork people should know this boat. It was actually only recently there was loads of cocaine found in it. So it made the news if you Google it. There was something overwhelming about that. And like I say, for me, this is something I've written about as well. I think the little rituals that I put in my life are massively a means of compensating for the absence of religion. I was brought up Roman Catholic, like most people listening probably, and that was a routine. And I guess school was a routine, and college was a routine. And now my life is very very lacking in those things. And it's not that I necessarily want to find religion again, but that I want to find these other little ways. Or, my aunt practices, or lots of people practice mindfulness, and I get lectured often about mindfulness, but really for me, mindfulness is the sort of the practice of sitting down and repeating the same gestures over and over. And if I mean something, or if I care about something, then I'll make something about it. And that's my way of figuring it out. But then having said all that, sounds incredibly noble. I sat down to make the 21st container ship after I'd made 21. And I just thought, I can't anymore. I'm going to puke. It's so boring. So I'm trying. So I will make more, but I need to find a way that like pushes the same buttons of sincerity, if that's the way, without actually going out of my mind.
I just have another question here as well, which is, do you collect your own souvenirs, not as artworks?
Well, I talked about the plates, and we did kind of stop doing that because it became such that I was traveling a lot, and I'm one of those people that gets a fridge magnet, from everywhere I go. And no, I have a lot of stuff, but there's nothing quite so, there's not a massive collection of anything consistent. I just have bits and pieces of things. When I was a kid, I used to get nationality dolls, which were, awful looking things now that I look back at them. Most of them plastic, some really nice ones, but, and I've always thought that there's something in that. Nothing behind myself now. Postcards and fridge magnets and stuff. And always, there's a project definitely in the dolls, but I haven't started it yet.
Fantastic. Can I just say a huge thanks for your talk today, Sarah, and to everyone for attending. Greatly enjoyable, and thank you so much for your generosity in home from home and from home as well, and for the talk today. And just before I say goodbye to everybody, just to say that we'll be back next week, and that will be with artist Julie Merriman as well, same time next week. So thank you again, Sarah, and thanks everybody.
Thanks a million. Thank you to everyone who came.